They gathered around you the way predators do when they think they've found prey too proud to sense the hunt. But you weren't prey. You were presence. And your silence didn't signal weakness. It radiated something they couldn't name. That's what rattled them. It wasn't anything you said. It wasn't anything you did. It was what you didn't need. You didn't need approval. You didn't need explanation. You didn't flinch under scrutiny, didn't shrink when others tried to study you. The ones who spoke in spells, who whispered curses behind backs and bent the energy of rooms with their rituals. They watched you walk through it all untouched, not because you deflected it, but because you absorbed nothing. They weren't used to that. They'd seen resistance before, but they'd never seen immunity. That's when they stopped calling you arrogant and started calling you something else. There's a difference between mystery and mastery, and you carried both, but the difference. Mystery asks for attention. Mastery doesn't care who's watching. That's what made them nervous. People who manipulate energy, who twist perception, who play with shadows, they rely on you giving them something to twist. But you gave them nothing. Your calm was too intact, your gaze too steady, and when they probed for the wounds you should have had, they found only space, stillness. Composure sharpened into something holy. You weren't healed. You were rewritten. And nothing rattles a witch like a being who no longer operates within the laws they can exploit. You made them question their own craft, their own tools, their own significance, because you didn't resist them. You transcended them. They called it unnatural, as if power only counts when it comes with theatrics. But your power wasn't performance. It was pressure. The kind that builds slowly and collapses systems when ignored. The kind that doesn't need followers or spells or chants. You didn't command the room. You calibrated it. Walked into chaos and shifted the temperature with a glance. You didn't raise your voice. You raised the stakes. And they felt it. Not in their ears, but in their instincts. The way predators do when a bigger predator steps in. The air changed when you entered, and those who once felt godlike in the darkness began to feel small. Their tricks lost traction. Their control slipped, and they hated it because they knew it wasn't luck. It was you. You were forged in isolation, not the dramatic kind, the kind that rewires the nervous system, the kind that strips away layers until what's left is not performance, but precision. While they were studying darkness, you were mastering detachment. You learned how to sit in pain without reacting, how to feel insult without responding, how to walk through envy without flinching. And that kind of sovereignty, that terrifies people who survive by reading weaknesses. They couldn't find yours. Not because you faked strength, but because you no longer needed to prove it. You were beyond reaction, beyond prediction, beyond reach. And those who once prided themselves on decoding people couldn't read you anymore. You made peace with every shadow inside yourself, so theirs had no place to land. That's what broke their illusion. You didn't run from their darkness. You saw it, named it, and stepped around it. They tried to intimidate. You tilted your head. They tried to provoke. You blinked. They tried to mirror your energy, but theirs cracked under the weight of imitation. Because what you carried wasn't learned. It wasn't borrowed. It was earned through silence and forged through solitude. It was the residue of every breakdown you didn't narrate. Every betrayal you buried without announcement. Every moment you chose alignment over applause. You didn't need to defend yourself. The atmosphere did it for you. People who weaponize perception fear the ones who walk untouched through projection. You weren't immune because you fought the lies. You were immune because you didn't breathe in the air they polluted. You didn't wear your story like armor. You let it evaporate. They searched for wounds, but found portals, and that terrified them. Because if you could survive what you survived and still walk like that, still look calm, still sound composed, still see clearly, then maybe you weren't just a survivor. Maybe you were something unexplainable, something they couldn't categorize, something they couldn't curse. They stopped speaking in front of you, not out of respect, out of fear that you'd hear what they didn't say. And that fear was justified. because you didn't need to catch lies. You smelled them before they formed. You didn't need to see betrayal. You tasted it in their silence. You became fluent in the language of motive, in the dialect of micro-expression. And they knew it. Knew they couldn't hide behind performance anymore. So they called you cold, alien, other. Not because you lacked humanity, but because you had transcended the version of humanity they relied on exploiting. They couldn't handle the fact that your aura wasn't protective. It was prophetic. You didn't claim power. You exhaled it. That's what stunned them. Because real power doesn't speak in declarations. It speaks in detachment, in composure that doesn't blink under pressure, in boundaries that feel like steel doors locked without explanation. You didn't attack. You didn't even respond. You simply didn't engage. And that absence of engagement became a mirror. One that showed them everything ugly about themselves. One that reflected their manipulation back at them, unfiltered. And they hated you for it. Not because you hurt them, but because you didn't need them. They lit candles. You became fire. They chanted for influence. You stood in your stillness, and the room bent anyway. Because presence, when it's rooted in truth, becomes gravity. And gravity cannot be faked. It cannot be mimicked. They tried to match your tone, your walk, your gaze, but nothing stuck. Because mimicry without mastery falls apart under pressure. And pressure is all you walk in. You are the embodiment of aftermath. The calm after wars others didn't survive. You wear the invisible scars like thrones. And those who think darkness makes them powerful feel exposed, next to someone who has survived it without bitterness. They needed a reaction from you the way parasites need a host. It was never about truth. It was always about bait. These people, the ones who walk into rooms not to connect but to control, they operate like illusionists, but darker. Their entire game is built on confusion, on making you doubt what you know, on warping the mirror just enough that your reflection looks like a threat to itself. But they require your cooperation. They require your vulnerability to be unguarded. They can't twist what you don't give. They can't feed if you stop bleeding. And you did. That was your rebellion. You stopped providing fuel. You stopped correcting false narratives. You stopped handing over your softness as a bargaining chip. And when they reached to manipulate your energy, they found nothing but their own intentions reflected back at them. That is what broke their grip. The realization that you had sealed every emotional opening they once slipped through. They thrived when you needed to be understood. They flourished when you felt obligated to explain. Their strength came not from their own clarity, but from your internal war with perception. They built castles in the fog of your self-doubt. And as long as you played along, defending yourself, over, clarifying, adjusting to their moods, they stayed in power. But you began to notice the pattern, that your peace always seemed to fracture around them, that your energy drained faster in their presence, that conversations with them weren't dialogues, but traps disguised as concern. You stopped treating their confusion as genuine. You stopped trying to teach people who were only there to twist the lesson. And in that moment, they lost access, not to your body, but to the energy they fed on like thieves with invisible hands. You became emotionally inaccessible, not by becoming cold, but by becoming clean. You cleaned out the need to defend your choices. You cleaned out the reflex to fix what you didn't break. You stopped giving people pieces of yourself, hoping they'd see the full picture. You stopped explaining your piece to people who live in chaos and call it freedom, and that disturbed them. Because manipulators aren't built to handle people who are self-contained. They aren't built to manipulate those who don't seek approval, who don't ask to be believed, who don't hand over their narrative like it's community property. You rewired yourself for silence, for poise, for presence that doesn't beg. And when they tried to twist you, they found no openings, no handles, nothing soft to squeeze. You became all blade and calm breath, a locked door in a burning room. They depend on unhealed parts of you. That's their entry point. Your trauma is their portal. Your empathy becomes their stage. But the moment you start healing, really healing, not with words, not with fake peace, but with boundaries so sharp they bleed ego. You become unrecognizable to them because their methods stop working. Their manipulations bounce off. Their guilt trips collapse mid-sentence. They throw the same bait, but the hook doesn't land. That's what causes panic. Not your anger, not your distance, but your lack of reaction. You went quiet, and it wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of someone who sees clearly. And people who play with shadows fear light like that. Not because it hurts them, but because it reveals how little they ever held. They don't confront you anymore. They skirt around your name because they feel it now, the lack of access. The sealed door, the absence of your energy leaves a cold draft behind. They used to count on your need to fix things, to understand, to give them another chance. They mistook that grace as ignorance. But grace without boundary is a doorway for parasites. You closed it. You no longer listen to tone instead of content. You no longer excuse betrayal because it came wrapped in a familiar voice. You treat intent like currency now. If it doesn't add value, you let it dissolve. And that terrifies manipulators. Because they thought they owned stock in your soul, you proved their investment expired. They send subtle jabs now. Half sentences, nostalgic references, bait disguised as familiarity. They need something, anything, to hook you again. But you give them silence. Not because you're bitter, but because you're aligned. They depended on your turbulence. But you became still water. They threw stones, expecting ripples, and the stillness swallowed them whole. There's a violence in peace that unsettles those who once fed off your chaos. You didn't become dangerous by fighting back. You became dangerous by no longer needing to. Because people who manipulate perception always assume they are the smartest person in the room, until they meet someone who has nothing left to prove. They twist because they're empty. They contort because they're drowning. And the only way they feel alive is by warping someone else's stability. But you stopped loaning them that lifeline. You stopped participating in your own distortion. They tried to narrate your story, and you took the pen away. No announcement, no monologue, just subtle recalibration. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped replying. You started doing things without disclaimers. Your power now lives in the fact that you no longer feed their version of you. And that silence is not just absence. It's absorcism. They once thrived in your empathy, but now that empathy is gated. Now it's filtered through logic, through sovereignty, through a self that no longer seeks validation in being kind to those who weaponize kindness. Your aura became a firewall, not because you blocked them, but because you outgrew the need to be seen by people who only view others as mirrors to manipulate. That's the line you crossed, the one they can't follow you past. The moment you chose peace over being perceived, integrity over being liked, awareness over being understood, and now they whisper about you. Not because you left, but because you left no door open behind you. You didn't have to expose them. They exposed themselves trying to twist something they could no longer touch. You didn't have to speak. Their confusion at your composure was its own confession, because manipulators count on you needing to be believed. You no longer need to be. That's what removed the mask from their face. The moment they saw you standing in clarity, unbothered, uninterested, untethered, they tried to sculpt your character from assumptions. But you became too precise, too quiet, too carved in truth for their distortion to take hold. Now, their words echo in a space you no longer occupy, a performance missing its audience. They expected your softness to be currency, an open wallet of empathy they could reach into whenever their egos needed feeding. They mistook your kindness for compliance. They assumed that your patience meant permission. Every time they crossed a line, they watched your eyes scan for meaning instead of sharpening for defense. And in that hesitation, they found opportunity. They played the victim to trigger your nurture. They faked confusion to provoke your clarity. They lied with just enough emotional tremble in their voice to make you feel responsible for fixing the cracks they caused. But something changed. Not loudly, not theatrically. You didn't burn the bridge. You let it rot. You stopped offering your softness as a peace treaty. You stopped letting your compassion serve as a loophole in your boundaries. You realized that every time you handed over your warmth to the wrong hands, you were giving them the weapon they would use against you next. You didn't stop being soft. You just stopped offering it as a sacrifice. You learned that compassion without discernment is not virtue. It is vulnerability leaking through a cracked foundation. You learned that some people interpret generosity as weakness, that they interpret forgiveness as an opportunity rather than a mercy. And so, you became measured, surgical. You kept your softness, but placed it in a vault. Not because it had no value, but because you finally understood how rare it was. You stopped presenting your soul like a feast at a table full of actors who were only there to eat, not to appreciate the cook. You no longer placed your heart in the hands of the emotionally bankrupt. You made peace with being misunderstood because you knew that the real you deserved more than temporary guests with permanent appetites. They sensed the shift, even if they couldn't name it. They noticed the silence after the games you used to pacify. They noticed the blank expression when they baited you with guilt. You didn't get colder, you got clean. Their tactics stopped working not because you hardened, but because you refined the access points.